I always believed peace was something you earned, not something you stumbled into. That's why after 42 years working in environmental engineering, most of it spent elbow deep in soil samples and battling red tape, I chose to retire in Meadow Hills. A quiet little town nestled between two ridges with a spring-fed creek winding lazily behind my property line. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest, until the new HOA came in. They were young, ambitious, full of big words like revitalization and modernization. Their glossy flyers promised walking trails, a new entrance sign, uniform fencing, and most concerning to me, updated stormwater solutions. That last one sent a chill down my spine the moment I read it. See, the thing about water is it remembers. Change the course of a stream and it doesn't forget. So when our new HOA board, led by a slick-talking real estate woman named Karen Holt, started talking about redirecting runoff from outdated ditches and improving drainage efficiency, I knew exactly what that meant. They were going to start digging where they had no right to. I tried to keep my nose out of it at first. After all, I was done with bureaucracy's reports and shouting matches in municipal offices. I'd put in my time. But on a sunny Tuesday morning in March, I stepped out onto my back deck, coffee mug in hand, and saw two men in neon vests spraying orange paint lines across the natural marshland just beyond my fence. I set my mug down. "Excuse me," I called, walking toward the property line. "What's going on?" One of them, a kid who looked barely old enough to shave, glanced up. "Drain line expansion, sir." "Who authorized this?" "HOA. We're contracted by Meadow Hills Development Solutions." That name was not familiar. Not on any list of licensed contractors I'd ever known. I asked for their permit. They didn't have one. By noon, I was standing in front of the HOA clubhouse, which used to be an old stone library. Karen met me at the steps with a rehearsed smile and hands that reeked of artificial charm. "Mr. Harlan, right?" she said. "I was hoping we'd meet eventually." "Then let's talk," I said, skipping pleasantries. "Those men marking the wetlands behind my home, are they under your direction?" "Absolutely. We're launching phase 1 of our runoff remediation project. The board approved it unanimously last week." "Did you file with the town?" "There's no need," she said, chuckling. "It's HOA-managed land." "No, it's watershed adjacent," I corrected, "which makes it regulated. The soil there has high percolation. Anything you put in the ground flows straight into Stony Brook and into the town's secondary water table." She stared at me blankly. I could practically see the words bouncing off her skull. "I worked 20 years on the state water board," I continued. "You so much as nick the wrong channel and you risk contaminating our entire community's well system." Her smile dropped. For a second, I thought she'd listen. Instead, she leaned back, arms crossed. "With all due respect, Mr. Harlan," she said, "we're trying to improve property values here. People are tired of muddy ditches and overflowing drains. You're welcome to attend our next board meeting, but frankly, we've already moved forward." That night, I sat at my kitchen table and pulled out the file box I hadn't touched in over a decade. Inside were old maps, hydrology charts, legal documents, and the original zoning regulations for Meadow Hills' Eastern Basin. I didn't plan to start a war, but I wasn't about to let a smug property manager with a marketing degree ruin my town's water supply. The first rainfall of the season hit 3 days later. A gentle shower turned into a steady downpour by dusk. I stood at the edge of the marsh boots, sinking into soft earth, and watched as the orange paint lines, now trenches, started pooling. The crew had dug straight into a low absorption zone, and I could already see the water failing to drain. 2 more days passed. That's when the bulldozers arrived. Not the towns, not the counties, private, loud, unregulated. They backed in over sidewalks and started ripping up the old concrete culverts like it was their backyard. I called the Department of Environmental Quality the next morning, gave them names, photos, GPS coordinates. The man on the phone promised someone would take a look, but I knew how long those wheels turned. Karen, meanwhile, was enjoying her little empire. I passed her in the parking lot outside the grocery store that week. She gave me a wink and said, "Sometimes progress is loud. Sometimes stupidity is louder," I thought. The worst part wasn't just the reckless digging. It was the way the board silenced anyone who questioned them. When my neighbor Sarah posted about the bulldozers on our community Facebook page, her comment was flagged and removed. Another man, Ed, who'd lived here longer than I, had stood up at the next HOA meeting to protest the illegal earthwork. They cut off his mic mid-sentence. "Stop being so negative," Karen told him from the stage. A week later, I got a letter taped to my front door. HOA citation. Obstruction of Community Improvement Plan. Apparently, my attempt to speak to the construction crew had been deemed interference. I laughed out loud. Then I sat down and typed out a letter of my own, addressed to the mayor of Asheville, the county engineer, and an old friend of mine who worked in state water compliance. That weekend, I walked to the creek behind my property. I knelt and scooped a handful of water. It was clear, cold, fresh, for now. But I'd seen this movie before. I knew how quickly things could turn, and I had a sinking feeling we weren't just flirting with trouble. We were inviting it in, building it a trench, and giving it a permanent place to flow. If there's one thing you learn in 4 decades of environmental fieldwork, it's that damage doesn't wait politely. It creeps in silently, often, in the form of water unassuming, unstoppable, and utterly indifferent to intention. That truth weighed heavy on me the morning I walked into the HOA meeting with a stack of documents under my arm and a bitter taste in my mouth. I wasn't there to make enemies. I was there to warn them. The clubhouse smelled like lemon-scented floor polish and ego. Karen Holt stood at the podium like she was hosting a real estate seminar, all teeth and swagger. Around her, a few board members I barely recognized from neighborhood walks nodded along as she clicked through slides of modern drainage and green beautification. Before we move on to community mural proposals, she said, "I see a resident has requested to speak. Mr. Harlan, go ahead. You've got 3 minutes." 3 minutes! I set my stack of maps, permits, and soil surveys on the table with an audible thump. "My name is James Harlan," I said. "I've lived in Meadow Hills for 17 years. Before that, I worked for the State Environmental Compliance Division. I was part of the team that approved the original runoff infrastructure for this neighborhood. And right now, you're tampering with it illegally." A few people stiffened in their chairs. Karen offered a tight, performative smile. "With all due respect, sir." "No, let me finish," I said sharply. "The area your contractor is digging through, that's a percolation zone feeding directly into the east basin of Stony Brook, which connects to the town's secondary water supply. What you're doing is not only unpermitted, it's reckless." One of the board members, a woman with a pearl necklace and a smug tilt to her chin, spoke up. "We've had standing water for years on that side of the neighborhood. All we're doing is improving drainage. Residents have complained." "Standing water isn't a license to poison a town," I replied. "You're diverting flow that was naturally filtered through marsh soil and sending it straight into the storm channels. You're removing trees that stabilize the banks. You're building a funnel for contaminants and doing it without a single hydrology study." Karen let out a breath theatrically long. "Mr. Harlan, we appreciate your concern. But the HOA voted. We have the right to maintain common areas. You do not have the right to alter the watershed," I snapped. "And if you continue without a proper environmental assessment, I will file a formal complaint with the DEQ and the county engineer's office." For a moment, the room went silent. Then Karen leaned forward on the podium. "Sir," she said slowly, condescendingly, "we've consulted with a landscape architect who assured us it's safe." "A landscape architect," I repeated, blinking. "You hired a woman who plants bushes to sign off on an excavation near a protected wetland." Murmurs rippled through the room. Someone in the back chuckled. But Karen wasn't laughing. "That's enough," she barked. "You've had your time." She slammed the gavel, but it sounded smaller than she probably wanted. As I gathered my papers, a few residents avoided my gaze. Others looked intrigued. Sarah, my neighbor, gave me a discreet thumbs up. I nodded and walked out, my jaw tight. That evening, I did what I should have done 2 weeks earlier. I sat down and wrote a formal complaint to the State Water Board. I attached aerial photos, GPS coordinates, and historical flow maps. I detailed how the natural drainage basins were being bulldozed without permitting, and how the HOA's work posed a direct threat to the town's drinking water. Then, I made a second copy. And I mailed it to the Buncombe County Environmental Justice Coalition, a scrappy underfunded watchdog group that had made headlines last year by stopping a subdivision from draining into protected oak savanna. It wasn't revenge, it was protection. I didn't want to fight. I wanted clean water. But the next morning, the fight came to me. A notice was taped to my mailbox. HOA violation, unauthorized communication with external agencies. Fine. I stood there for a full minute, rereading it. My blood pressure rose. Not from the money. From the gall. They were trying to silence me. I went back inside and pulled out my old scanner. I uploaded the letter, emailed it to every local journalist whose name I could find, and attached my DEQ complaint as context. By sundown, I'd gotten 2 responses. One from a reporter at the Meadow Hills Ledger, the other from a young intern at the regional environmental radio station. Both wanted interviews. I wasn't trying to be a whistleblower, but I also wasn't about to be bullied by a woman who thought trees were just fence obstructions. The next few days were quiet, eerily so. The bulldozers stopped moving. No new lines were painted. The workers disappeared. For a fleeting moment, I wondered if they'd backed off. I was wrong. 2 days later, at precisely 6:17 a.m., I was jolted awake by the deep, throaty rumble of engines. I stepped outside in slippers, coffee still brewing, and saw 3 backhoes rolling toward the eastern ridge, the one with the densest foliage and highest water flow. They hadn't paused. They were just moving faster before someone could stop them. I grabbed my phone, threw on boots, and marched straight to the trailhead. "Hey!" I yelled to the foreman, a large man in a grease-streaked vest. "This is unpermitted activity on regulated land." He gave me a blank look. "Got a problem, take it up with the HOA." He grunted. "We're on contract." He waved a clipboard with the HOA logo. I asked to see his state drainage license. He didn't have one. I took pictures. I filmed videos. I spoke into the camera. "This is Meadow Hills, HOA conducting illegal trench work on environmentally sensitive soil less than 40 feet from a waterway that feeds into our town's drinking supply." By the time I got home, the HOA had already sent out a community email. Subject: progress at last. "Thanks to your support, we're finally improving Meadow Hills' drainage for a better tomorrow. Ignore the rumors. This is safe, approved, and overdue." My phone rang. Sarah. She was crying. "I let my dog drink from the creek behind our house," she said. "He's vomiting blood." I felt cold. 2 hours later, Ed called. "My tap water smells like sulfur." I thought I was imagining it, but now I don't think it's just me. It wasn't. That evening, I drove to the old testing lab I'd built in my garage years ago for hobby work. I collected water from 3 places: the creek near my fence, the storm drain beside the playground, and my own kitchen tap. What I found made my stomach turn. Elevated coliform levels, traces of benzene, a spike in turbidity and pH. Someone had rerouted surface runoff into the stormwater system without proper filtration. And that water was now making its way into the town's secondary supply line. It was worse than I thought. I sat in the dim light of my garage, staring at the results. This wasn't just incompetence anymore. This was contamination, and I wasn't going to stay quiet. The next morning, the sound of metal tearing earth snapped me awake before sunrise. By the time I threw on jeans and boots, a convoy of machinery had begun carving the far end of the marsh like it was a blank canvas, gutting through clay soil root systems and decades of careful, natural layering like none of it mattered. It was chaos in motion. I grabbed my field notebook, my phone, and the faded green binder I kept for my days at the state compliance office, my little Bible of water law, emergency codes, and environmental disaster protocols. I didn't know yet how far this would go, but something in my gut told me that once the ground gave way, so would the lie holding all of it together. I wasn't wrong. By 8:00 a.m., I stood on the overlook by Stony Brook Ridge, documenting it all from my phone. Excavators were cracking old runoff conduits with zero containment strategy. Concrete chunks sat in open piles, and oily water seeped into the basin. Then I saw them, 2 women in polos, talking just beyond the work zone. Karen Holt and another woman I didn't recognize, tall and wearing a blue sports coat too clean for a job site. They were arguing. Karen's hand gestures were wide, impatient. The other woman handed her a folded envelope. I zoomed in. Cash. It wasn't a massive wad, but it was cash on a construction site in broad daylight. No documentation. Karen stuffed it into the inside pocket of her windbreaker and marched away without noticing me. I stood there stunned. I knew corruption when I saw it, but I didn't expect it to be this blatant. Not here. Minutes later, something shifted underfoot. The ground beneath my left boot sagged. I leapt back instinctively as the soil crumbled away into an exposed trench, freshly dug, shallow, with PVC pipes hastily installed and already leaking at the seams. I squatted to inspect, and what I saw nearly made me retch. The pipes were cheap grade, meant for irrigation, not sewage or storm drainage. The glue joints were smeared on haphazardly, some still wet. One of the couplings had burst, already trickling oily runoff down into the groundwater path that fed directly toward the east retention pond. This wasn't just negligent, it was criminal. I took photos, marked the coordinates. then opened the state's online whistleblower portal and filed a new complaint, unauthorized excavation and potential bribery, at HOA-managed project site. I attached the video of the envelope exchange. No accusations, just facts, time-stamped and geotagged. That afternoon, I returned home to find Sarah waiting at my porch with her toddler on her hip and a water jug in the other arm. "Our tap's running brown," she said. I handed her 2 clean gallons from my garage stash. "Don't let him drink anything unfiltered." I couldn't stop thinking about her dog. Behind her, 3 more residents approached Mr. Kennedy, who'd lived here since 1985. Anna, from the cul-de-sac, who ran a small gardening business out of her backyard, and Jamil, a quiet high school science teacher who rarely spoke at HOA meetings. All of them carried bottles jars, even Ziploc bags filled with water samples. "Is this normal?" Anna asked, holding up a cloudy mason jar. I didn't have to test it to know the answer. That evening, I hosted the first unofficial backyard water meeting. We lit citronella torches, sat on overturned buckets and patio chairs, and for the first time since this mess began, the neighborhood had a conversation that didn't involve Karen or HOA agendas. We started comparing symptoms: itchy skin, stomach cramps, strange metallic smells from washing machines. And all of it had begun since the trenching started. Jamil quietly took notes. I showed them the trench video, the leaking pipes, the cash handoff. There were audible gasps. Mr. Kennedy muttered, "That woman's going to jail if there's any justice left." Sarah asked me the one question I'd been avoiding. "How do we stop them?" I paused. Then I answered truthfully, not alone. That night, I sent every photo, every video, every water test result to 3 places: the Department of Environmental Quality, the Buncombe County Public Health Office, and quietly to a former colleague of mine named Dr. Evelyn Russo. She'd moved up to a regional director position in the Environmental Enforcement Division. We hadn't spoken in years, but she had once told me, "If you ever see something go wrong that smells like politics more than science, call me." So I did. She picked up on the second ring. I gave her the short version. The unlicensed worked the trenching, the pipe burst, the bribery. She didn't say much, just asked me to upload everything to a secure folder she'd send me shortly. "You'll have boots there by Friday," she said. "Don't let anyone fill in those trenches until then." By Friday morning, the bulldozers were gone. The site had been roped off with caution tape overnight, and at 8:14 a.m., 3 black SUVs bearing the seal of the Environmental Enforcement Division rolled through Meadow Hills' gates. Karen was not smiling this time. She stood near the HOA clubhouse in a wrinkled button-down shirt, sweat blooming under the armpits, surrounded by uniformed agents and clipboard-carrying inspectors. One of them pulled out a drone and launched it over the trench site. Another began testing soil samples with a portable analysis unit. I stayed on the sidewalk, out of sight, just watching. By lunchtime, the gossip had reached every mailbox, something about toxic discharge and EPA involvement. A few board members were spotted leaving the clubhouse with their phones glued to their ears and expressions of pale confusion. Later that day, I received an email from Evelyn. Subject: confidential, James. Preliminary testing confirms benzene trace nitrates and possible gray water infiltration, all unauthorized. Formal cease and desist issued to HOA as of 11:02 a.m. Enforcement proceeding pending. Do not engage directly. More soon. ER. It was the first time in weeks I exhaled fully. That night, the Asheville Water Department issued an alert. Residents were advised to boil all tap water until further notice. Karen posted a panicked message on the HOA Facebook group blaming historic infrastructure decay and unforeseen chemical residue from old farming equipment. It was full of buzzwords and deflections, none of which explained how new drainage pipes could leak industrial solvents into a protected basin. By now, the damage was undeniable. But the truth, that was just beginning to surface. It began with a whisper, an offhand comment from a child at the community pool. "Mommy, why does the water smell like eggs?" Nobody listened at first. Chlorine has its quirks, and kids say odd things. But then someone noticed the faucets were sputtering. The water from kitchen taps ran a pale, almost tea-colored hue. Not brown, not muddy, but unmistakably yellow. By that evening, 10 households had posted photos to the neighborhood message board, some blurry, some vivid, all of them horrifying in their sameness. Glasses of water lined up on countertops, like crime scene evidence. One picture showed a pot of boiling pasta foaming an unnatural yellow. Another showed a bathtub half full, looking like someone had poured in weak lemonade. That night, the Asheville Health Department issued a second advisory. This one was sterner, no longer just precautionary. Do not consume tap water without boiling. Do not allow pets or children to drink from hoses or outdoor taps. The mood shifted instantly. A buzz of concern turned into outright panic. I was standing in my driveway when the first angry neighbor approached. His name was Derek, mid-30s, father of twins, ex-military turned IT consultant. He held a gallon jug with cloudy water sloshing inside. "You were right," he said, breath short. "My kids have been drinking this for days. One of them's throwing up. The others got hives." He wasn't yelling, but his voice was sharp, with panic barely restrained. "I sent everything to the DEQ," I said calmly. "State's already investigating. The system's been compromised, likely from the drain rerouting they did behind the retention wall." That HOA president, he spat. Karen, she lied to all of us. Said everything was greenlit. More people joined neighbors I hadn't spoken to in months. People I used to wave at during morning walks, but never truly knew. Now we stood together in the dusk, our bottled samples reflecting porch lights and car headlights. Sarah appeared, pushing her toddler in a stroller, her face drawn and pale. "Emergency room gave my son VA fluids," she said quietly. "They think it's bacterial." The nurse asked where we lived. When I said Meadow Hills, she didn't even flinch. Said we were the 5th case tonight. I swallowed hard. Jamil came walking up from the eastern cul-de-sac, cradling a box of lab gear. "I brought strips," he said simply. "We can test pH, nitrates, chlorine. Won't tell the whole story, but we'll know if it's a crisis or a catastrophe." We set up a folding table in my garage, old science kits, newer home testing kits, printed EPA guidelines. It all felt like a makeshift war room. The strip dipped into the first sample from Sarah's faucet, came up glowing a sharp green. High nitrates, dangerous. The next test showed a bizarre fluctuation in chlorine level spikes in places, almost none in others. Whatever was happening wasn't just contamination, it was systemic failure. By midnight, we had a crude but sobering map. The worst contamination clustered around properties east of the trench sites, exactly where runoff from the illegal drain work would have flowed. We sent the results to Evelyn. She replied with one sentence, "And this confirms our fears, possible graywater intrusion. Stay back from those trenches. Avoid inhaling mist." I didn't sleep that night. At 6:30 a.m., the mayor of Asheville appeared on local news. He looked shaken. The Department of Environmental Quality has launched a formal inquiry into the Meadow Hills drainage modification, he read from a paper. Residents are instructed to continue boiling water. The HOA has been issued an immediate cease work order. Then came the quote that would ripple through our town like a thunderclap. "We are treating this as a public health emergency." Karen tried to go live on Facebook an hour later. Her eyes were bloodshot, her smile twitchy. "Let me be clear," she began, "this situation is being overblown by individuals with a personal vendetta against this HOA. She gestured wildly to a whiteboard behind her, showing meaningless charts and real estate buzzwords. "This isn't about water. This is about politics, about resisting progress. We did what needed to be done for property values." "Turn it off," Sarah muttered beside me. "She's going to get someone killed." But before I could mute the stream, something extraordinary happened. Mid-sentence, Karen was interrupted. A voice off camera, "Ma'am, the state officers are here. They have a warrant." The video froze, then cut. The chat exploded with reactions. Someone posted justice. Another typed checkmate. That afternoon, official vehicles swarmed the HOA office. Residents gathered in hushed clusters along the sidewalks as agents filed out of SUVs with vests labeled EED, Environmental Enforcement Division. They carried scanners, sample kits, drone gear, and legal binders. I stayed at a distance. I wasn't there to gloat. I was there to protect the water. An agent approached Karen, who stood at the top of the steps in a wrinkled suit and sweat-drenched collar. "You're the president?" the agent asked. Karen nodded, swallowing hard. "You authorized the excavation and rerouting of groundwater channels behind Stony Brook Ridge." Karen opened her mouth, closed it, then opened it again. We had board approval. We thought it was landscaping." "Did you have a permit?" "Well, we didn't think we needed one for drainage." "Did you consult a hydrologist?" "We had a landscape architect," she mumbled, voice breaking. That was when the crowd gasped. I didn't cheer. I just watched as the agent held out a folder. This is a formal notice of violation under the State Environmental Code, Title 13. You are hereby ordered to cease all HOA-led infrastructure projects until further review. Someone from the crowd yelled, "How much is this going to cost us, Karen?" Another voice, "My baby's sick because of you." Karen looked like she might faint. Later that evening, the Meadow Hills Ledger published an online expose titled, "Project Linked to Water Contamination, Did Leadership Ignore Expert Warnings?" They included a quote from me, a short one. If they had listened, this wouldn't have happened. But water doesn't forgive ignorance. The article went viral locally. A regional news station picked it up the next day. Then the county sent its own inspectors. By Sunday, bottled water was being delivered to every home in Meadow Hills. The HOA's funds were frozen, their website shut down. And the yellow water, it kept flowing for another week, quiet, sinister, a stain we couldn't see, but everyone could taste. But something else began flowing too. Accountability. You could see it in her eyes. Karen wasn't sorry. She was scrambling. 3 days after the state issued the cease and desist order, and half the town's water tested positive for nitrate contamination, the HOA board held an emergency town hall. It wasn't sanctioned by the county. It wasn't even legal technically since the HOA was under suspension. But Karen spun it like a community update, and people showed up anyway, more out of rage than curiosity. The meeting was held in the old school gymnasium, where folding chairs creaked under angry residents, and fluorescent lights flickered overhead like a warning sign. I sat in the back row silent, my arms crossed, a folder of documents resting on my lap like a loaded weapon. Karen stood at the center of a makeshift stage flanked by 2 of the remaining board members. The others hadn't shown up. One had resigned. Another had reportedly skipped town. She started with a hollow greeting. "Good evening, neighbors. I know many of you are concerned, but I want to clear the air and set the record straight." The murmur in the room was cold, suspicious. The recent water issues, though unfortunate, are not a direct result of the improvements our board approved. We have reason to believe the infrastructure beneath Meadow Hills was failing long before our term began. I shifted in my seat. "Old clay piping improperly maintained filters town negligence," she continued. "Our drainage improvements may have revealed vulnerabilities, but they didn't cause them." Someone stood up near the middle row. It was Jamil, the science teacher. "That's a lie," he said calmly. "I tested the water at 5 different sites. The only elevated contaminants appeared downstream of your trench work." Karen straightened her tie. "We appreciate your input, ma'am, but we have spoken to multiple industry consultants who say otherwise." "Name them," Jamil fired back. Karen blinked. "Excuse me. Name one consultant," Jamil repeated. "Not a landscaper, a certified hydrologist. One." Silence. Someone snorted. A woman near the left aisle stood up next. "My daughter has E. coli from our faucet. She's 7, she said. 7. We boil our water, we filter it, and still she got sick." My pediatrician filed a report. You know what it says? Groundwater contamination from disrupted filtration. From trench work. She held up a printout and shook it like a weapon. Karen's face paled. The murmurs turned to grumbles. People weren't just angry anymore. They were disgusted, betrayed. But Karen wasn't finished. In addition to failing infrastructure, we have also encountered obstruction from certain residents who attempted to interfere with our work, she said, glaring toward the back row where I sat, including some who submitted inflammatory complaints to the state, which triggered unnecessary panic. Every head turned. All eyes found me. I didn't stand. I didn't flinch. I just raised my hand and held up the folder. Then I walked to the front, climbed onto the stage without invitation, and turned to face the crowd. "You want the truth," I said. "Here it is." I opened the folder and spread out maps, photos, and test results on a nearby table. "This," I said, pointing to a dated permit, "is the original zoning plan from 1986, approved by the State Environmental Commission. It outlines the natural marshland Karen's contractors tore up without permits." I flipped to the next page. "This is a photo of the trench with low-grade PVC pipes leaking directly into the aquifer, taken 3 weeks ago." Gasps. "And this," I said, holding up a chart, "is a breakdown of nitrate levels taken from my home, from Sarah's home, and from the public storm drain behind Stony Brook Ridge." I turned to Karen. "You didn't uncover a broken system. You created one." The room erupted in applause, loud and emotional. Someone shouted, "Resign." Another yelled, "You poisoned our kids." Karen raised her hands like a woman drowning, trying to tread water in public shame. I didn't approve the pipes directly, she stammered. The contractor. You paid her in cash, a voice screamed. I saw the video. That broke her. She stammered something about miscommunication, about being misled, about serving the community's best interest. But it didn't matter. The wave had already broken. The tide had turned. And no amount of spin could rebuild what she had shattered. That night, the HOA board was dissolved by an emergency vote pending the outcome of the state's legal review. The county took temporary administrative control over Meadow Hills. For the first time in decades, the HOA had no president, no authority, no voice. Except mine. And I didn't want power. I wanted accountability. The next day, I was interviewed by the local NBC affiliate. Not because I sought fame, but because people needed to hear that the danger was real and preventable. Why didn't they listen to you, the reporter asked. I looked into the camera and said, because they thought appearances mattered more than consequences. When the interview aired, my inbox flooded. Some offered support. Others shared their own HOA horror stories. A retired biologist from a neighboring town offered to help us set up long-term water testing. A community college professor asked if she could use Meadow Hills as a case study for urban environmental mismanagement. But what hit me hardest was a handwritten letter that arrived 2 days later. It was from a woman named Marcy, the wife of a board member who had quietly resigned. Dear Mr. Harlan, my husband didn't speak up. He saw what was happening, but he stayed silent because he was afraid of Karen, afraid of being ostracized, afraid of legal fallout. I begged him to say something. He didn't. But you did. You saved people. Thank you, Marcy L. I read it twice, then tucked it into the same green binder that had started all this, because I knew we weren't done. The water was still yellow, and the real work, restoring trust, rebuilding safety, re-educating a community that had been gaslit by its own HOA, was just beginning. The binder lay open on my dining table, each page meticulously arranged in clear plastic sleeves. Years ago, I'd started collecting documents as a hobby after retiring site maps, hydrology reports, regional zoning records. Some people collected stamps. I collected proof. I never thought it would be my armor. But that morning, after the town meeting and Karen's public meltdown, I knew it was time to take everything I had and make it undeniable. I didn't just have theories. I had the truth measured, dated, and archived. The first document I reached for was the 1986 hydrology report commissioned when Meadow Hills was still in planning. It outlined exactly where the natural runoff zones lay, colored in blue and green with contour lines showing how rainfall trickled through marshes and filtered down into the aquifer. The site Karen's team had bulldozed was marked High Saturation Percolation Zone, Do Not Alter. I flipped to the next plastic sleeve, an EPA compliance memo from 2003, reminding HOAs across the county of their obligation to consult with hydrologists before making drainage alterations. The same policy Karen had waved away in a board meeting, claiming it only applied to new developments. Wrong. It applied to any watershed-adjacent land, regardless of age. Then came the pièce de resistance, an email dated 6 months before the first trench was dug from a consulting engineer at the county who had responded to Karen's initial request for guidance on surface drainage beautification. The engineer had written, warning, any excavation within 100 feet of Stony Brook Ridge must undergo pre-review under County Statute 8.2.9. Do not proceed without environmental survey. It was all there. Karen knew. She had been warned. She just didn't care. I scanned the files, uploaded them to a secure cloud folder, and shared access with Evelyn at the Environmental Enforcement Division. I added a cover sheet summarizing each violation and how it tied to the contamination now wreaking havoc across our community. By mid-afternoon, she called me directly. You weren't exaggerating, she said, voice clipped with purpose. We're preparing a formal enforcement notice against the HOA and the contractor they hired. We'll also be pushing for civil liability under the State Clean Waters Act. I sat in silence for a moment. Do you think the residents will be okay? I asked. We're working on an emergency remediation order, she said, but it depends on what else we find in those trenches. If they poured anything into those lines, paint, oil solvent runoff, it could take months. After we hung up, I opened the binder again. Not to reread it, but to remember what it represented. This wasn't just paperwork. It was evidence. A record of what happens when someone plays God with a natural system they don't understand. That night, Jamil and I set up a makeshift testing station at the edge of the retention basin. He brought in a portable spectrometer, and I dug out an old mini centrifuge I hadn't used in a decade. We wore gloves, headlamps, and quiet determination. We worked in silence under a starless sky, disturbed only by the occasional croak of frogs, survivors of a shrinking habitat. Around 10 p.m., Jamil looked up from the scope. Trace elements of toluene, he muttered. And barium, not just nitrates anymore. I rubbed my eyes. Industrial solvents. Could be old paint, maybe from the contractor's equipment, he said. Could be worse. I looked across the water and saw the dim outline of Karen's two-story house. She had closed her curtains shut off her porch lights and vanished from public view. Cowardice had its own kind of darkness. But across town, the lights were still on at the community center. Volunteers were handing out bottled water. A group of teens was filling coolers for seniors. Sarah was there too, with her toddler strapped to her back, helping distribute supplies. We weren't waiting for heroes. We were becoming them. By the next morning, the county filed its official environmental infraction notice. The headline was brutal. HOA facing civil penalties over water crisis violated multiple environmental codes. The article named names. Karen Holt, Meadow Hills Development Solutions. The contractor revealed to be operating under an expired license. It cited my maps, my photos, my findings. But they didn't call me a hero. They called me a concerned resident and former environmental official. I liked that better. It wasn't about being the face of this fight. It was about being the spine. The next few days moved quickly. The HOA's assets were frozen. A temporary special administrator was assigned by the county to oversee community maintenance. A GoFundMe started by Jamil and Sarah raised enough money to buy high-capacity water filters for every home in Meadow Hills. And Karen was served with a civil subpoena on her front lawn by a woman in khakis and a blue DEQ windbreaker. She didn't wave. She didn't speak. She just stood there barefoot in her robe, staring down at the thick envelope that might as well have been a mirror. Later, I found out from Evelyn that the state was investigating the cash transaction I had recorded possible bribery, maybe fraud. If the contractor testified against her, things could get very bad. I wasn't gleeful. I wasn't angry anymore. What I felt standing in my backyard that evening as the sun dipped behind the ridge and the water in the creek shimmered with its first signs of clarity was something I hadn't felt in weeks. Relief. The fight wasn't over, but the truth had found its way to the surface, just like water always does. They arrived on a Thursday morning unannounced, but unmistakable. 3 state-marked SUVs pulled through Meadow Hills' gate just past 9:00 a.m., driving slowly, deliberately, like a warning rolling on rubber tires. The vehicles stopped outside the HOA clubhouse, which had been shuttered since the emergency vote dissolved the board. The only thing that remained was the rusted mailbox and a weather-worn sign that still read, Community, Cleanliness, Value. Ironic now in every word. I watched from my porch as half a dozen officers and specialists stepped out, 2 from the Environmental Enforcement Division, 2 from the Department of Public Health, and 1 woman in plain clothes who walked with the stiff posture of a state investigator. Behind them, a white utility van rolled up and began unloading portable testing kits, drones, and water analysis equipment. Evelyn had warned me this might happen. If the nitrate and solvent readings hold, she said over the phone, the night before we'll deploy a full response team. This is no longer just HOA negligence. This is public endangerment. The news spread fast. Within 20 minutes, neighbors had begun to emerge, gathering in small knots on sidewalks and lawns, watching the officials like they were the opening act of a trial we'd all been waiting for. Kids with bicycles hovered near curbs. Dogs barked from behind fences. And somewhere deeper in the neighborhood, I knew Karen was watching it all from behind drawn curtains. I walked over to the sidewalk, careful not to intrude, and nodded at the lead agent. She was a tall woman in her late 40s with a clipboard in one hand and a GPS tracker in the other. Her vest bore the seal of the state's Environmental Protection Bureau. She gave me a small, respectful nod. Mr. Harlan. Yes, ma'am. I'm Special Investigator Lena Curtis. Your documentation has been extremely helpful. I nodded. Glad to assist. What do you need from me? We'll need escorted access to the trench sites, especially the ones bordering Stony Brook Ridge, and the eastern retention pond. We'd also like to verify the drainage entry points you flagged on your site map. I'll take you there myself. The walk was quiet. A few neighbors followed at a distance. Lena asked concise questions about the depth of the trenches, the direction of the backflow, where the unlicensed piping was installed. I answered all of them. It felt like I was back in the field, clipboard in hand, ankle deep in clay, mapping out how man and nature collided. When we reached the main trench, now sagging waterlogged and flanked by wilting brush, Lena paused. Her team circled it, like surgeons inspecting a wound. This is worse than the photo, she said softly. She crouched beside the exposed pipe, snapped a few pictures, then took out a core soil sampler. As she twisted it into the ground, I noticed the thin shimmer of an oily film floating over pooled runoff. She noticed it too. Toluene, she muttered. Or worse, possibly a degreasing agent. The moment was interrupted by a shout from one of the junior agents up the ridge. We've got cross-contamination. Everyone rushed toward the noise. The young man had opened a storm drain grate, and inside was a rush of grayish water, laced with foam flowing rapidly too fast for a line that was supposed to be dry in the dry season. Confirmed bypass into the town's secondary line, he said. Lena's voice turned cold. Get water samples, call the mobile lab, and somebody notify the county. This wasn't just a violation anymore. It was proof of causality. The illegal trenching had introduced foreign runoff into the town's infrastructure, and that meant the HOA was directly liable for the contamination that had sent kids to hospitals, shut down kitchens, and caused a crisis of trust that no public apology could fix. Back at the clubhouse, the plain-clothed investigator emerged holding a file box, half burnt, on one side as if someone had tried to torch it but chickened out halfway. Inside were receipts, handwritten notes, a contractor agreement, and tucked between them, a list of payments that didn't line up with official expense reports. The investigator looked grim. We may have mail fraud here, she said. There's an attempt to conceal. By mid-afternoon, the state had declared Meadow Hills an active environmental investigation zone. Drone footage of the trench system was uploaded to the state database. Lena's team began marking areas for soil remediation, including a wide swath behind Sarah's house, where the creek now ran sluggish and sickly green. I walked home, slowly feeling the weight of months of dread slowly shift into something else. Not triumph, not satisfaction, but a strange and quiet grief. This place was supposed to be a sanctuary. We had moved here to escape noise, danger, unpredictability. And now the ground beneath us had betrayed us, not on its own, but because women like Karen had treated it like a spreadsheet instead of a living system. Just before sunset, Lena knocked on my door. We're staging a community meeting tomorrow, she said. The mayor will be there. So will the Buncombe County Water Commissioner. You've been asked to speak. I stared at her. Me, she nodded. People trust you. You warned them. You fought for their health. You're not just a witness anymore, Mr. Harlan. You're part of the recovery. I didn't answer right away. I was tired, bone-tired. But she was right. The damage was real, but so was the responsibility. That night, I sat down at my desk and wrote out what I would say. Not about blame, not about Karen, but about water. About the way it remembers, reshapes, and eventually reclaims whatever we try to bury. I ended the speech with one line that came from deep within me. And you cannot control what you don't respect. And Meadow Hills will heal not because we rebuild it, but because we finally learned to listen to what was always beneath our feet. The emergency hearing was held in the Buncombe County Courthouse on a warm Tuesday morning. By 8:00 a.m., the line to get through the security checkpoint curled around the marble steps. Reporters mingled with residents holding jugs of cloudy tap water, faded protest signs, and folders full of hospital receipts. The air buzzed with something between fury and anticipation. Inside the courtroom, a temporary panel had been assembled. One state environmental judge, a deputy from the public health office, and the county commissioner himself, flanked by legal counsel. On the other side of the aisle sat Karen Holt, pale, sweating, and alone, her once perfectly pressed suit jacket wrinkled at the elbows, a thin legal pad trembling in her lap. I sat near the back, next to Jamil and Sarah. Sarah's son was with her, clutching a stuffed dinosaur and sipping bottled water through a straw. At exactly 9:05 a.m., the gavel dropped. This emergency hearing is now in session regarding the environmental violations reported in Meadow Hills, including unlawful trenching, groundwater contamination, and potential criminal negligence by the Acting Homeowners Association. It was surreal hearing the words said out loud in an official room under oath. The first to speak was the lead investigator from the Environmental Enforcement Division. She delivered a methodical summary dates of the violations, photos from the trench site nitrate spikes confirmed by independent labs, drone footage showing chemical runoff directly bypassing standard filtration routes. Then came the forensic accountant. She stood up and held aloft a stack of paper, her voice crisp. This, she said, is a reconstructed expense report showing over $42,000 in unreported payments made to Meadow Hills Development Solutions, an entity owned indirectly by Ms. Holt's cousin. Gasps. Whispers. Someone cursed under their breath. The judge raised his hand for silence. Then he called the defendant to testify. Karen stood slowly, her chair scraping across the floor, with a sound that seemed louder than it should have been. She walked to the podium and stared straight ahead as if rehearsing the words on the ceiling tiles. Ms. Holt, the judge began, "You are not required to speak. But if you do, your words are under oath." Karen licked her lips and nodded. "I understand." She gripped the edges of the podium like it might collapse beneath her. I never intended to hurt anyone," she began. The HOA was under pressure to fix flooding issues. Residents were complaining about backyard pooling erosion. We didn't have the budget for a full survey, so we made the call to proceed. "You mean you made the call?" the judge corrected. Karen flinched. "I thought we were doing what was best for the community," she mumbled. "And the contractor," she assured me, "everything was above board." "Did you review the county's environmental code before approving trenching?" I know, Karen admitted, not directly. "Did you receive a cease and desist letter from the State Environmental Commission prior to continuing excavation?" Karen hesitated. "I saw the letter." The courtroom fell silent. Her lawyer buried her face in her hands. "And did you hire an unlicensed crew without soil containment protocols?" Karen's voice cracked. "I didn't know they weren't licensed. My cousin set it up." That's when the scream started from a woman in the audience. "You lied to us!" she shouted, rising from her seat with shaking hands. "My son has had 3 seizures in 2 weeks. You poisoned him." A bailiff stepped forward to intervene, but the judge held up a hand. "Let her speak," he said gently. The woman, now crying, turned to the room. "We trusted her," she sobbed. "All of us. We just wanted clean yards and working drains, and instead, she gave us poison." People nodded. Some cried. Sarah hugged her son tightly. Karen's shoulders caved forward as though the air had left her lungs. After a moment, the judge struck the gavel again and cleared the floor. The next speaker was me. I didn't want to do it, but I knew I had to. I walked to the podium and faced the panel, not Karen, not the crowd, just the law. "My name is James Harlan. I'm a retired environmental engineer and a resident of Meadow Hills. I came forward when I noticed the first signs of illegal trench work. I submitted reports, photos, and water samples. I was ignored by the HOA, fined for interference, and accused of spreading fear." I paused, but I didn't want to fight. I wanted to protect my neighbors, people who trusted their water, their homes, their health to a system they thought was looking out for them. I handed the judge a map. "This is the original drainage blueprint for Meadow Hills, dated 1986. The areas that were dug up were marked as protected percolation zones. That was ignored." I held up a second document, and this is a DEQ warning sent directly to Ms. Holt prior to excavation, stating clearly that no alteration could occur within 100 feet of Stony Brook Ridge. That too was ignored. I looked at Karen just for a second. Negligence isn't just forgetting to read the rules. It's choosing not to. I stepped down and walked back to my seat, heart pounding, hands cold. The hearing continued for another hour, more testimony, more documents, more expert statements. At its conclusion, the judge gave a preliminary ruling. Based on the evidence presented, he said this court finds sufficient cause to initiate civil liability proceedings against the Meadow Hills HOA and refers the matter for criminal investigation under the State Clean Waters Act. Applause erupted. It wasn't joy. It was release, months of tension finally spilling out like pressure from a bursting pipe. Karen sat in silence, her face ashen. As we left the courthouse, neighbors patted my back. Sarah squeezed my hand. Jamil smiled quietly, respectfully. That night, a handwritten sign was taped to the clubhouse door, marked closed until further notice by order of the state of North Carolina. And for the first time in weeks, I stood at my sink, turned on the faucet, and smelled nothing but clean water. After the hearing, Meadow Hills felt like a town waking up after a long illness. The air smelled different, crisper maybe, or maybe it was just that I was finally breathing again without the weight of dread pressing down on my chest. But even in relief, the work ahead loomed large. The contamination wasn't just legal or emotional, it was physical. The damage ran through the soil, the pipes, the trust in our community's systems, and someone had to step in to repair it. I didn't expect it to be me. But as the days passed and officials rotated in and out of the neighborhood, it became clear Meadow Hills needed more than external oversight. It needed leadership quiet, steady, and grounded in knowledge. It started with a knock on my door. Jamil stood on my porch, holding a clipboard and a thermos. "There's a committee forming," he said, "under the county's guidance, a civilian oversight task force to help coordinate the water restoration plan." I hesitated. "I told them you're the only one with the full map of our original water infrastructure," he added. Of course he did. The next week was a blur of blueprints, conference calls, and site visits. Lena from the Environmental Enforcement Division remained our liaison to the state. She asked if I'd serve as technical advisor for the filtration system upgrades. I agreed on one condition: I don't want a title. No chairmanship. No HOA 2.0. I just want clean water for my neighbors. She smiled and said, "That's exactly why you're the right person." We began by cataloging the damage. 3 trench sites needed backfilling with approved material. 2 drainage pipes had to be removed entirely, one of which had already collapsed, sending gray water into a culvert that backed up near the schoolyard. The retention basin behind Sarah's house tested high for both nitrates and toluene. It had to be drained, dredged, and lined anew with filtration sand and carbon layers. The county brought in equipment, but the planning, that was ours. We mapped out the new lines on a giant sheet of mylar spread across my garage floor. Sarah marked locations where children played. Jamil annotated proximity to gardens and vegetable beds. Anna, our gardener neighbor, flagged native plants that could help with soil stabilization. Mr. Kennedy offered to organize a volunteer crew for manual labor. What Karen's board had tried to bulldoze through, we built from the ground up with purpose, not pride. By week 3, bottled water deliveries were replaced by industrial filtration units installed in residents' basements. The hum of purification pumps became the neighborhood's new lullaby. Kids learned to read test strips before bedtime like brushing their teeth. One afternoon, while checking runoff from a rebuilt swale, I saw Sarah's little boy crouched next to the creek, gently floating a leaf boat in the newly cleared water. It didn't smell anymore. It didn't foam. It just flowed clean, cold, quiet. That night, Sarah knocked on my door with a peach pie and tears in her eyes. "I don't know how to thank you," she said. "You already have," I replied. "You never stopped showing up." And that was it. The healing wasn't dramatic. It wasn't marked by headlines or fanfare. It came in moments: the return of a blue heron to the marsh, the quiet joy of planting new trees, where scars had been the first time I drank from my kitchen faucet without flinching. The county formally released its final report on the Meadow Hills crisis a month later. It cited clear violations by the former HOA, praised the role of community coordination, and recommended legislative updates to restrict future HOA authority over environmental infrastructure. I received a letter from the governor's office thanking me for my service to the people of Meadow Hills and the state. I didn't frame it. I stuck it in the back of the same green binder where everything had begun. But the biggest moment came quietly. It was a Sunday morning. I was kneeling by the creek planting watercress with Anna and her niece. The soil was damp but clean. The stream bubbled with life again. And that's when a boy, maybe 10 or 11, rode past on his bike and called out, "Thanks, Mr. Harlan." I looked up. "Thanks for fixing the water." And he was gone. I sat back on my heels and smiled, not the kind you force, but the kind that surprises you, gentle and full. We had restored more than pipes. We had reclaimed dignity, truth, connection. The HOA building remained closed. A new oversight board was forming, elected diverse, and for the first time accountable to the county. Karen hadn't been seen in weeks. Rumors swirled that she'd moved in with family out of state, that she was being deposed for a separate fraud case involving her cousin. I didn't care anymore. She could disappear into whatever silence she wanted. I had a garden to tend, a town to love, a creek to protect, and finally, peace that didn't come from compliance, but from justice earned drop by drop. The creek behind my house sang again. It didn't roar like a river or gurgle like a fountain. It sang in that subtle way only clean, free-flowing water does. A whisper over stone. A shimmer through roots. It had taken months to hear that sound again, and now that it was back, I didn't take a single note of it for granted. I sat on my back porch with my coffee and a worn field notebook in my lap, not because I needed to take samples anymore, but because the habit of observation was hard to shake. Some mornings, I still found myself scanning the banks for chemical sheen, for foam, for anything that felt out of place. But more and more, everything looked just right. What had begun as an HOA vanity project had nearly destroyed a community. But somehow, it ended with us neighbors once isolated behind fences and bylaws, working together like roots weaving under soil. Every step in the restoration process became a seed of something larger resilience. We didn't need the HOA anymore, not like it had been. A few weeks after the emergency hearing, the county held a community reorganization session. Residents poured into the old gym again, not in anger this time, but in cautious hope. This time, there were no suits, no high chairs or gavel drops, just folding tables, clipboards, and sign-up sheets. Sarah stood and nominated Jamil to lead the new Water Safety Committee. He accepted, but only if Anna and I joined as technical consultants. I agreed reluctantly. I don't want any position, I reminded them. No official title. You've already got the only one that matters, Jamil said with a smile. Protector. That stuck with me. One of the state environmental agents returned a month later to monitor progress. She stopped by my porch, leaned against the rail, and said, "You know, there are municipalities that spend $500,000 on public awareness campaigns and still don't get this kind of engagement." I shrugged. All it took was nearly poisoning a town. She smiled a little sadly. Still, it's rare. You should consider consulting again. I looked past her toward the creek where Sarah's boy was skipping stones. I think I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. There was no courtroom this time, no article, no applause. Just small moments, a neighbor stopping by with a thank you note, kids building a science project based on the creek's filtration system, Anna planting wildflowers where the bulldozers had torn earth. Respect didn't arrive with ceremony. It came in waves, in knowing glances and quiet nods. During morning walks, in the simple way people began turning to one another again. Karen's house remained on the market for months. No one wanted it. Eventually, the county repossessed it to cover legal costs. The clubhouse, once a symbol of gatekeeping and entitlement, was repurposed as a community co-op space. A mural, now stretched across its front wall, painted by local teenagers, a heron rising from blue waters above the words, "We listen now." And we did. We listened when someone spoke up about new water discoloration. We listened when Anna explained the importance of native grasses over decorative gravel. We listened to each other because we'd finally learned what happens when we don't. One day, a young couple moving into the neighborhood stopped by to introduce themselves. The husband shook my hand and said, "We've heard stories about you." "Good ones, I hope," I replied. He laughed. "Legendary ones. People say you're the guy who took down the HOA with a binder." I chuckled. I just opened the right pages at the right time. Later that evening, I sat by the water and watched the sky turn orange. I dipped my hand into the stream and let the current pass through my fingers. Clean, cool, honest. I thought about everything we'd lost, time, trust, safety, and what we'd rebuilt, not just infrastructure, but a fabric of connection too long neglected. I didn't have a title. I didn't have a nameplate or an official letter from the county hanging on my wall, but I had something better. I had neighbors who waved when they saw me. I had a garden that grew. I had water that ran true. And in a world full of noise, I had the sound of a creek that healed because someone finally had listened.